see, funniest thing, Hugh, is that I always figured that I would bump into you with our polar work, but we missed each other south, and I've missed you at all kinds of glorious conferences all over the world and events of different sizes, you name it. And it's very funny that we should finally meet virtually.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I know you because you always pop up on my TV, but actually having a real conversation with someone from the TV is very different.
It's very funny. And I tell you, I've been following your work very closely because, you know, it's been some years since I was the base commander at Rotherham, but of course, you know, once it's in your blood, it's there. As Frank Wilde said, the little white voices continue. Definitely. So when there's something to do with Antarctic science, and you're so great of a communicator that I follow all of your stuff. So I'll tell you what, we better get on with this and get started. You've already got some questions. You've already got some questions coming in, Hugh, and you haven't said anything yet.
It could be about my hair or something. Okay, we'll get started.
Love it. So gives me great pleasure, everybody, to introduce my Antarctic colleague, Hugh Griffiths. Over to you, buddy.
Thank you very much. And I'm just sharing my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see that. And I will just start my presentation. And so starting off with an image that could be any tropical reef in the world with sponges and corals and all sorts of invertebrates. And actually, this is a scene from Antarctica. So a lot of people may be shocked and surprised to see even any color in Antarctica, but to see this amount of life. And we'll come back to my world of underwater creatures later, but I'll start with some evidence that I've been to Antarctica. I've been on 7 expeditions to Antarctica and 3 to the Arctic so far. So I tend to end up in cold places. So no tigers for me, but plenty of wildlife, which I'll show you in a minute. And it's a beautiful place, but it is the coldest, windiest, highest, driest, most remote continent on Earth, which makes it a very difficult place for life to survive. And to give you an idea of what Antarctica looks like, because most people probably couldn't draw a map of Antarctica, it's actually a huge land-based continent covered in ice that's got floating ice around the edges and ice in the sea around it, but it's hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest land and surrounded by very strong winds because there's no land to slow them down, which drive the strongest and fastest current in the world, which isolates Antarctica, keeping it cold and biologically mostly separate to the rest of the world. Starting off with my limited knowledge of life on land, I'm not a terrestrial biologist, I'm a marine biologist. And life on land is very simple. So I'm not going to talk about the marine mammals and birds that you associate with Antarctica on land, because actually they feed and live mostly in the sea. But the land is pretty much mostly covered in ice. So less than 0.04% of the surface of the Antarctic is free of snow and ice. And the ice sheets in some places are 4 kilometers thick. So if you're a small animal or plant trying to get a foothold there, there's not many places you can live. And when it comes to plants, we only have a few groups of plants, mostly mosses and liverworts. We also have lichens, and in very few places, slightly further north on the Antarctic Peninsula, we have tussock grass. But essentially the plants are very simple, very small, and some of these things can take thousands of years to grow. And they only grow a sort of fraction of a millimeter every half a century or something, some of these places in the coldest areas. So, and what lives on and around these plants are a very select small group of animals that are probably the hardiest animals you can think of. So tardigrades or water bears, they're pretty much indestructible. They've been sent to the vacuum of space and still survived. Springtails and mites, and the biggest animal, proper land animal we have in Antarctica is a wingless midge. And so that gives you an idea of how difficult it is to survive in Antarctica. And pretty much all of these animals can survive being frozen alive, defrosted, and carry on with their lives again. So that's pretty much it for life on land. It's a very simple system. It's an excellent system for monitoring change with climate change and things, but it's also a very vulnerable system because pretty much any larger and more invasive species that could come in with climate change would be able to take advantage of this environment, and these animals wouldn't have much defense against it. Moving on to where more comfortable is life in the sea. Now, life in the sea, I chose a penguin for this picture because everybody knows about penguins in Antarctica. But actually, this schematic diagram here shows you that there is a lot more to the life in Antarctica than just penguins. And we have an estimate of around 20,000 species so far that we know of from Antarctica. And that's quite a lot more than most people would be able to name, I'm guessing. And of these, 90 or so species are the cute and cuddly, the higher predators, the penguins, the seals, the seabirds, and the whales. So we'll just have a quick look at how they're getting on in Antarctica. So these are firstly a selection of pictures I took on my last expedition, and it's a bit of showing off, but also showing you how close you can get to wildlife in Antarctica, because they're really not scared of humans because they don't know human beings. They don't see us on a daily basis. So when a big red or blue ship turns up, they all come over and have a look. And penguins are iconic of Antarctica because they are the most common bird in the Antarctic. And there are 17 types of penguin in the world, but only 2 of these, the emperor and the Adelie penguin, make the Antarctic continent their true home. That means living around all year round and nesting there and breeding there. And the one that most people have seen, the emperor penguin. Now, emperor penguins are the ones off Happy Feet and other things like that. And they're absolutely stunning birds. They nest on ice, so they actually never let their egg or their chick touch the ground. They keep it in a special pouch, and they shuffle around and take it in turns to get food for their chicks. My favorite penguin is actually an Adelie penguin. Adelie penguins are little troopers. They are pretty much indestructible. They'll take on bigger enemies. So if there's something trying to attack their chicks and things, they'll really fight back, but they're also incredibly inquisitive, and they'll follow you around to find out what you're up to. And these penguins here are Adelie penguins, and this is as we passed them in the ship last year, and they were taking a look at us, realized we weren't something they wanted to be near, and dived into the water and swam across to the next piece of ice. And you'll notice that they're very fast in the water, and they're incredibly good at just jumping out onto the ice. And one of them goes the wrong way, which isn't bad for the 50 or 60 penguins that are there, that only one of them pops out and turns right instead of left. But I can assure you that that one caught up with its friends later on. Seals, on the other hand, there are 6 species of seals that are native to Antarctica. There are leopard seals, Ross seals, Weddell seals, crab-eater seals, fur seals, and elephant seals. Now, elephant seals are amazing. They're huge bags of blubber that can dive down to almost 2,400 meters deep in the ocean. And they're so good at diving that oceanographers even attach equipment to them to be able to do studies of the ocean in places that are hard to get to. And this is an elephant seal, as I said, a big bag of blubber. And once one of them decides to lie on the road outside your station, there's not much you can do about it, really. Second type of seal I want to talk about is the leopard seal. It's the only Antarctic seal that eats other seals and penguins and fish and krill, and it will pretty much eat whatever it feels like because it's one of the top predators in Antarctica. Only one other creature eats leopard seals. And as you can see by its face, that's a face made for catching food, mostly teeth and mostly mouth, and that jaw can open up to almost 180 degrees so that it can grab another seal as an ambush predator. Crab-eater seals, on the other hand, are potentially one of the most numerous large mammals on the planet. They're estimated to be somewhere between 7 and 75 million individuals on the Earth. And it's really hard to count them because they live their entire lives out on the sea ice. And that makes them difficult to count. But new technology, and colleagues in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK are using satellite imagery to identify and count seals from space. And given that these animals are so far onto ice that ships can't break, then that's the only way you can really count them. And at least 15 species of whale spend time in the Antarctic, including the blue whale, which is the largest whale that's ever lived. In fact, the largest creature that's ever lived on the planet. And I was talking about the one thing that ate leopard seals. Over 160,000 orca or killer whales live around the Antarctic, and they are the top predator in the region, even taking on some of the large whales. And there's one of the killer whales that was at the station where Paul used to be in charge of. Now, going from the very biggest to the very smallest, life in the plankton is very different. So plankton are microscopic creatures and plants. And in this case, you can see some of the tiny plants, which are the basis of most of the Antarctic food chain. These tiny animals live in tiny plants live in the surface waters, and they reproduce very rapidly, but they don't tend to sink. But they are eaten by about 700 or so species, including fish and things that live deeper down. But at the top of this chain is the Antarctic krill. There are literally billions of Antarctic krill. They live in swarms that can be kilometers across, and there can be millions and millions of individuals in each swarm. And they provide the food for things like whales, seals, and penguins. And they very quickly reproduce, and they're between about 3 and 6 centimeters long. And the tiny plankton at the surface, the tiny plants, are eaten by the krill. And these krill turn what is very difficult to sink because of their shape with the plankton into nice droplets that will sink to the bottom of the sea. So it's a polite way of saying krill poop, that then transfers energy from the surface of the ocean into the deep, dark depths of Antarctica. And that's why I'm interested in them, because they're actually feeding the creatures that I study. And for me, life at the bottom of the sea is definitely the most interesting part. It's the kind of equivalent of the tropical rainforest or the coral reef. It's got a huge number of species, at least 19,000. And to put it into perspective, every time we go there, between 10 and 20% of the species we find are new to science. So this number keeps going up every time people look. And these views are really stunning to me. There are so many different classes and phyla of animals in this picture. You could go on for a whole day just looking at this one image, but there are sponges, soft corals, feather stars, brittle stars, and who knows how many other things. And you can have entire PhDs studying these kind of images from Antarctica. But they're very beautiful and very varied. And not all of Antarctic seafloor looks like this. In some areas, there's a lot of soft mud, and that mud is incredibly rich in food. So that's full of worms and clams and things, but the really photogenic stuff is the hard substrate. And you can see there are even fish in Antarctica, but we don't have things like crabs and lobsters and sharks. So all these kind of large crushing predators really are absent. So the filter feeders and the things that eat this marine snow, as we call it, actually do incredibly well. And the biomass of food from that 24 hours of daylight in the summer really gets very high. And sometimes the food that reaches the bottom of the sea isn't plankton based. In this case, it's an unfortunate Adelie penguin, which has died at the surface and sunk down to the bottom and become dinner for some sea urchins and some brittle stars and even a starfish down here by its feet. And I just want to show you a video of what it's like at the bottom of the sea in Antarctica. So there are large sponges. You can imagine each of these sponges is about 1 meter tall. There are hard corals and soft corals. There are tunicates with small invertebrates living on them and filter feeding worms. We have an Antarctic fish living inside a sponge and using the lights from the ROV to find the krill going past. Normally they'd have to do this in darkness because it's hundreds of meters down. In the background, we have a giant Antarctic sea spider. In the foreground, we have an octopus and an ice fish, some really big animals. And these sponges here are about 1 meter or 1.5 meters tall, and they have huge invertebrates on them. So giant feather stars, giant brittle stars that are waving their arms to catch krill. And these feather stars here are actually swimming because they've detected our ROV, and they're now swimming away from danger. And I like this last scene because it's a sponge garden. So most of the organisms you can see are sponges, except for this one thing here where the red laser beams are pointing at, which is a giant sea anemone, probably about 1 meter long. So if you compare that to ones you get in the rock pools or tide pools around where you live, then it's an amazing thing. And this is some more underwater photography from slightly shallower water taken by our divers at Rothera Station in Antarctica. And we study these kind of animals long term. And this is a feeding aggregation. So we have starfish, which you probably recognize. And then we also have a little tiny fish over here. But there are also sea lemons. And sea lemons are a type of sea snail or gastropod. And they actually have a very thin shell inside their bodies. Now, this image is of brachiopods. And brachiopods are an ancient group of organisms that look a bit like clams, but aren't closely related to them. And we also have some sea cucumbers and some starfish. And this kind of image is more reminiscent of the fossil record than it is of modern day marine life elsewhere, because most of these groups are very sensitive to crushing predators, like I mentioned, that are absent from Antarctica. And to give you an idea of scale, here's one of our divers swimming next to a cliff covered in invertebrates. There's such a sea of life out there, and it's got everything from sponges to sea anemones to soft corals. And the pinkish colored thing you can see on this rock is actually a pink encrusting seaweed. And you can just about see a sea cucumber's tentacle sticking out there. And this is an amazing organism. It's an ice fish. They don't have any red blood cells because they don't really need them. So the water in Antarctica is so cold that it can store a lot of oxygen, which means this really oxygen-rich water means that animals don't have to work so hard to get the oxygen into their bloodstreams. But what it does have in its blood is antifreeze, because the water it's living in is about -2 degrees centigrade, which makes it, if it was normal blood, it would probably freeze up. And that makes this animal very specially adapted, but also sensitive to climate change, because the water warms, the oxygen levels would drop. Another example of a giant animal is this sponge, but it's actually relatively small compared to some of the deep sea ones. But the limit on how big some of the things can get in the shallows is really determined by how much iceberg damage happens around them, because they can be hit by shallow water icebergs. And the loss of sea ice around Antarctica in some areas is meaning icebergs move more, doing more damage to the seafloor. Now, some examples of things you wouldn't really see in those photographs. So we've got some worms that will be too small to see that live in the mud as well. And then some other larger worms, which are predatory and will scamper around on the surface of the mud. Here are examples of mollusks from Antarctica. So we've got octopus, we've got gastropods, we've got nudibranchs, we've got even an Antarctic limpet, we've got bivalves, the sea lemon I told you about, and this thing is particularly special. It's a chiton, so it's a many-shelled gastropod type mollusk. And these, you might look at them and think they look like living fossils. These are isopods, so related to the pillbugs or woodlice in your garden. And these are Antarctic cerulid isopods. And the one in the middle looks so much like a trilobite that its species name is Trilobitoides. And it really shows you that evolution can repeat itself many times. Here's another giant Antarctic isopod. And that one's bigger than the size of an adult hand, and it's Glyptonotus antarcticus, and it's one of my favorite Antarctic animals because it does very well in our aquarium, so we can show visitors exactly how big some of these Antarctic animals get. Related to the sandhoppers on the beach, or the sand fleas as some people call them, these are an amazing array of Antarctic amphipod crustaceans, and they come in an amazing range of shapes and colors and sizes. And some people will be surprised by seeing corals and their relatives in Antarctica. So mostly soft corals, but a few hard corals in there, including cup corals and whip corals. But you've also got some soft corals like umbellula, which if this was stretched out would look like a sunflower, and it waves in the currents and uses the head, which is covered in tentacles, to catch food as it passes. These are sea cucumbers, so types of echinoderms, and the one in the middle is about ½ a meter across, and the one underneath it, if anyone watches Octonauts and knows anything about deep sea organisms, this is a sea pig which walks along on these little feet and uses its mouth end to hoover up all the sediments. And these are more echinoderms. They're brittle stars, so they have somewhere between 5 and hundreds of arms depending on which species it is, and the one in the middle is actually a basket star because the arms divide and divide and divide. And speaking of organisms with lots of arms, here's the Antarctic starfish, and probably the king of the Antarctic starfish is the one in the middle, which has 50 arms. And it actually, unlike most starfish, which will go around kind of hoovering up things on the seafloor or hunting for mollusks, that one will wave its arms in the water column and can even catch krill as they're passing. And my favorite of all the Antarctic arthropods are the sea spiders. And these are much bigger than you find them elsewhere in the world. They can be the size of a dinner plate across. The one in the middle has 12 walking legs, whereas most sea spiders have 8 elsewhere in the world. And they're just spectacular. And to illustrate just how amazing they are. From one expedition, one catch on one expedition, here is a bowl full of mostly Antarctic sea spiders. So it looks a bit like pasta, but every one of those little bits you see is the leg of a sea spider. And sea spiders are amazing because the males do all the parenting and the females disappear and leave it all to the males. Now, these two animals are up on the screen, and anyone who reads faster than I do will notice that it's got the word Griffithsii and Huii in the names. And that's because, as I was saying earlier, we find so many new species when we go down there. I've had a real honor of having people name species of sea cucumber. So they're not the prettiest things in the world. They're not the most attractive animals, but they're very important to me because they're the first animals that were ever named after me. And I just want to sort of stop it there because we're coming to time, but thank you very much for listening. And if anyone's got any questions, I'm sure Paul will pass them on to me.
Hey, Hugh, that's great stuff. If you could stop. Yeah, there you go. Right, we're in. Hugh, thank you very much. You brought back a lot of fabulous memories, as you can well imagine. And I didn't understand you had 2 sea cucumbers named after you. How great is that?
Yeah, it was amazing because they both come from the same expedition, and they were working through so many samples that they started running out of new names for the new species they were finding. So they said, can we use your surname? And then they came back a few months later and said, can we name another one after your first name as well? So I wasn't going to argue with that, but it was a real honor. Absolutely not. And it's not a bad indicator of how much there is to learn down there, is there? Exactly. If they need to name them after me, though, everyone's going to get one eventually. Oh, it's absolutely good. So, Hugh, we've got, no surprise, we've got some good questions for you. And equally no surprise, you know, you're a marine scientist. The first question is something to do with geology. So good luck. Here, yes. We've got people watching from all over the world, 60+ countries, and a big push just at the moment from Greece, Argentina, South Africa, Malaysia, Italy, Spain, and India. So we've got an international team that can help us if neither you nor I can figure it out. But here's the question. How long ago was Antarctica entirely free of ice? And what was the CO2 level at that time? We're asking. I don't know the CO2 level, but what I do know is that there's some debate because the Antarctic mountains will have had ice for a long time. The Antarctic has been where it is for almost roughly the same position for about 100 million years, and things left Antarctica and spread out. And there will have been small ice caps on the mountains, but when exactly they spread out to cover the continent is a matter of debate. And they probably started somewhere around 30 million years ago, but actually the main ice sheets would have been 3 to 5 million years only. So it's not been this white blob of ice that we recognize it as today for as long as people think. 35 million years ago, plus there were trees and things on Antarctica, and 65 million years ago, there were dinosaurs and forests and all sorts of things. So what we're seeing now is not what Antarctica's always looked like. Great, well done. Thanks very much, Hugh. And inevitably, we've got a question here. What do you wear when you dive in Antarctica? We know you don't wear Speedos, Hugh, but what kind of gear do you wear when you're under that cold water? So unfortunately, I don't get to dive because I go on the ships and do the deep sea work, but our divers wear very sophisticated equipment. So unlike the scuba diving equipment where you'd wear a regulator in your mouth, because of the dangers of that freezing up, these days we have full face masks, which also gives the advantage of if there are leopard seals and things around, you can radio down and have a live conversation with the divers. And they wear a lot of layers, but actually the suit's fully self-contained dry suits. And the water temperature -2, which sounds really cold, but actually a few layers. And the advantage in winter of being able to dig a hole and drive on a skidoo out to that hole, jump in, do your dive and get back, compared to the faff of setting up a boat that you do in most other places, you could probably get warm quicker getting out of the ocean in Antarctica than you can anywhere else. Yes, that's certainly been my experience, Hugh. We used to come out of the water, get on the skidoo, and we'd soon be in the Bonner Lab standing under a hot shower. You can't beat it. I've often been much colder on the south coast of Britain, as you say. And then, Hugh, there's a thing in my mind about when we go to these remote places, you know, at the end of the world's longest supply chain, to a place where most people, let's face it, will probably not go. How valuable is that? And can you use that gap as the energy to tell powerful stories? Or does it actually make it much harder to tell
meaningful stories to people who won't go there? What do you think?
I think we're really lucky because some of the organisms, like those giant sea spiders, like the penguins, they're really iconic, and you don't have to sell it to people. And most people, it's alien and fantastical to them. So you see a penguin, and people will queue up at zoos and things to see a penguin, and people will pay incredibly large amounts of money to go on cruises to Antarctica to see them as a holiday. So there is that appetite, but telling someone why it's important for their economy, or telling someone why a policymaker should worry about Antarctica that's far away, is much harder. And I think people power is on our side, but policy making is the harder thing to convince people about. I think it is relevant to everybody, but letting them know that what happens in Antarctica affects the rest of the world is harder work to make that connection for them.
Well said, Hugh. Yes, and I do know that feeling, because we're often told we're trying to create, with pristine seas, we help create large marine protected areas. And what we always learned was that when you speak to fishermen, you don't talk about marine protected areas, you speak about fish. Okay, we've got more questions.
Cool.
How can we, as a general audience, help the conservation of Antarctic biodiversity?
Well, the amazing thing about Antarctica is that the fisheries and things are well managed in Antarctica. So it is very easy for us to do proper legal regulation of things. And when the rules change, people abide with them. So thousands of albatrosses a year are saved by changes in policy. And that comes from pressure on governments and things. So when there was longline fishing that would catch all the albatrosses, people changed the rules. And now they're protected and doing much better in Antarctica. And it's such a short connection between us as scientists and our governments for these kind of things. We can make those recommendations and they can change in months. So that's amazing. But there are other threats that we can't control in Antarctica, like climate change. So really the message of reducing the carbon footprint, pressure on governments to change the way industry and things work as well, because as an individual, you can do so much. But actually the biggest polluters out there are still the biggest industries. So we need to do our own bit, but we also have to put pressure on people to make these protections. And actually, most people want to help. So I think it's up to governments and things to act on what people want. I don't think there's anybody out there deliberately wanting to make a penguin homeless.
Great question, great answer. I mean, I've got a question here which is fun, Hugh, because you've just given us a beautiful 25-minute presentation, and it's from Alice. So Alice, if you're watching still, here's your question. What exactly do you do?
What do I do? Unfortunately, I spend most of my time in Cambridge in an office or a laboratory, but every so often I get to go on very large ships down to the Southern Ocean. So we'll fly down to the tip of South America usually, or to the Falkland Islands, get on one of the research vessels. Some people will have heard of Boaty McBoatface. That's now changed its name to David Attenborough. So that's the one I will be working on in the future. And we use a whole range of equipment to investigate what lives at the bottom of the sea. So we'll use mapping using sonar to see what the shape of the seafloor is. We'll use devices to tell us what the water's like. And then we'll sample the seafloor life, whether it's with cameras to just get images like I showed you, but also if it's a new species, you need a physical collection of that specimen. So we use either small nets or robots, underwater robots, to collect animals for us to bring back and study.
Great stuff. Well, look, Hugh, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you at last, having been revolving around each other.
Finally, yeah.
And different events. And hopefully sometime soon we'll have a cup of tea at BAS headquarters in Cambridge or something together.
Excellent. And thank you to everyone for watching. It's been a real pleasure.